Welcome back. I hope that everyone had a really good break over this consolidation week and that you didn't have too many assessments hanging over your head. I was very pleased with everyone's work on assignment number 2, part 1. I know that there's a number of steps in it. Not everyone got around to listening to the collaborate recording either. So it was a little bit tricky, but people got there, and overall I take quite a gentle touch with that particular assessment. It's one of those group assessments which is always a little bit tricky in an online environment. So sometimes that's just how we have to work. So I do take into account some of the confusion, sometimes late submissions, the fact that different people might work at different paces in groups. So well done everybody. You should be very proud of your effort. And I don't know if anyone can notice behind me my little mascot Sophie over there. That was a dog we inherited about 6 months ago. So say hello, Sophie. Anyway, Sophie's asleep. So I recommend a small dog for anyone with children, considering dogs that don't shed and do not smell. But off to more important things. We're talking about Syria this week, and I find Syria really fascinating. Now, the interesting thing about Syria and why it's a really great example of intervention is it really highlights and raises some of the issues around intervention. So firstly, if we go right back to the beginning when the world first became aware of the conflict in Syria, it was actually the Assad regime and committing crimes against its own citizens. So dissidents or people who wanted to lobby for more democratic reforms. So everything down to chemical weapons were being used against its citizens. So back then there was some conversation around the United Nations Security Council about should we get a mandate for what's called humanitarian intervention. This is when a country fails to have the ability or fails to take care of its own citizens. Does the international community step in and basically override its sovereign rights to take care of its own affairs? Now, for the United Nations to have such a mandate, not only does it go back to its own member countries, which is basically most countries in the world, but there is a vote by its 5 permanent members. Okay, so this is Russia, China, France, UK, Russia, China, France, UK, and USA. Now, particularly when it comes to Syria, Russia has always been a sticking point. It's got certain relationships with the Syrian government, and this has always been a real difficulty in the United Nations getting a mandate. So one of those permanent members has veto power. So essentially that didn't happen. And so we had these ongoing problems with the Assad regime. But then in come another actor, and that was terrorism, basically. And so terrorist groups overtaking different areas of Syria and taking advantage of some of the turmoil there. And so what we had then was a greater enemy than the Assad regime. And not only that, but the Assad regime was also fighting against the terrorists. So what we then saw was the Assad regime, which was at one point considered the enemy, then became the friend against the greater evil, which was the terrorists. Okay, so then you have countries fighting against terrorism there. Now, recently there was one city, and I'm sorry, I cannot remember the exact name of it, but it had been controlled by terrorists with horrific human rights abuses and heads on sticks in the middle of the square, things like that for years. And they did actually negotiate some international players, I think including the United Nations backing some of the Syrian militants, did actually negotiate a peace there to get rid of the terrorists out of that particular town. But in order to negotiate that settlement, it wasn't a case of getting rid of or annihilating the terrorist threat. It was actually a case of shipping them all out. So basically, the deal that was done is, hey, our families can get out of the town without being killed or hurt ourselves. And they were basically shipped somewhere else, which it doesn't take Einstein to realize that this was in fact a case of shipping the problem somewhere else. So here you have all sorts of issues. Countries, what happens when countries can't intervene and should, as we saw in the case of Syria, and a few of you have done assignments on Rwanda, so there's been talk about how the international community essentially did not go in when they should have. And then what happens when countries actually do intervene and negotiate peace settlements like that, which can just ship the problem somewhere else in the region, even though obviously for the people of that particular town and city, this was, very significant. So, what's the cost and benefit ratio of that? Certainly, there have been peace settlements where all parties need to come to the table, including some of the ones that have committed atrocities. So, what are some of the issues around that? And this is some of what we will get into in the second half of the course when you start reading around intervention and different methods of conflict resolution, and also what can apply and work to, say, Israel and Palestine might be different in Rwanda or the Middle East or whatever. So you can use these issues and topics to comment on other people's team threads and virtual collections for your second half of your assessment, A2. And very definitely some of the themes we'll be talking about, we want to see you apply it to case studies when it comes to assignment number 3. Or you might choose a different type of question to discuss conflict resolution. But I hope you enjoy the second half. It is a very busy first half in this course, but I hope you feel encouraged that you've already done a lot of the really hard groundwork. And I've been very proud of your efforts. Thank you.